class. Can I get somebody to volunteer to hand out the handout? I thought I gave you one. All right, just raise your hands if you don't have one, and we'll get them distributed to you. All right. Well, last Sunday we did yeah. It's actually for 1 Samuel 1 and 2. It's front and back. We're going to use it for this class and hopefully the next class as well. 1 Samuel chapter 1. We introduced ourselves to the book of 1 Samuel last time. Oh, good. Lots left over. We introduced ourselves to the book of 1 Samuel last time, and actually I said in the last class that 1 Samuel is really the first part of what was originally a single book in the Hebrew, the book of Samuel. And in the first part of the book of Samuel, the first 7 chapters deal with Samuel, the prophet of the Lord. Chapters 8 through 15 deals with the reign of Saul, King Saul, and his successes and his failures, and ultimately his rejection by God as king. In 1 Samuel 16, David is anointed, and from then on to the end of 2 Samuel 4, there's this conflict between the house of David and the house of Saul, which ends with Saul and all of his family being supplanted and David becoming king over all Israel. The remainder of 2 Samuel 5 through 24, is devoted to the sole reign of David. Now, in 1 Samuel chapter 1, we have the story of Hannah and the birth of Samuel. And if we could, maybe get some... I'm going to try to be better about getting volunteers to read. Can I get somebody to read the first 8 verses of 1 Samuel chapter 1? No, that's fine. Just be well, the correct pronunciation is the confident one.
Okay.
Thank you, Cindy, for braving that reading of complex names. Ramathaim, Zophim, and all those others, right? Nobody really knows how these names were actually pronounced. And in fact, we're just looking at English transliterations of the Hebrew. So basically, the best pronunciation is the one that you say and people don't notice. I guess that's what I'm told anyway. So everything I pronounce is basically a guess. Anyhow, in the opening of this book, we're introduced to some of these characters. But the main character in the story is going to be Hannah. He introduces Elkanah, who's from Ramathaim Zophim. I don't have a map of where that is because nobody really knows where that is. It's kind of disputed. The name Ramathaim literally means 2 hills, and Zophim may simply refer to the people that live there, the descendants of Zuph in verse 1. No, it's nowhere near Nalgonda, but nice try. Yeah, between the hills, that's right. No, it is nowhere near Nalgonda, India. It does say that it is from the hill country of Ephraim. Why does that location sound familiar to us?
Like last story of birth.
Yeah, actually, both of the last stories of the book, there's two stories at the end of the book of Judges. They both begin with a reference to the hill country of Ephraim. One of them is Micah and the idols, takes place right there in the hills area of Ephraim. And the other one doesn't take place in that location, but the Levite is from that location. And so it's interesting how Judges 17:1 and 19:1 both begin with references to the hill country of Ephraim. Now, why in the world would he say that? Why in the world would Samuel begin by mentioning the hill country of Ephraim? I mean, besides the bare bones, well, that's where it happened. What is that intended to make us think about? Well, I mean, why would the author try to make this look so similar to the end of Judges? Well, maybe, or he's trying to purposefully link to those stories in the book of Judges. I don't know if the author's the same. We don't know who wrote most of the Old Testament books. But the phrase is linking the beginning of Samuel with the end of Judges. Now, the last two stories we've read that had the hill country of Ephraim, a lot of bad stuff happened. And if we know Judges, and we're reading this book in continuity with Judges, we might be sort of scratching our heads and going, something bad going to happen here too? And that's not what takes place, though. The narrator continues to surprise us by telling us about something good that happens. That's what we're going to see here anyway. Elkanah is the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite, but the book of Chronicles traces Elkanah's genealogy a little differently. In 1 Chronicles chapter 6, we learn that while Elkanah lived in the hill country of Ephraim, and so I guess by that definition could be called an Ephraimite, we learn that he's listed in the descendants of Levi. In 1 Chronicles chapter 6, beginning in verse 16, the sons of Levi were Gershom, Kohath, and Merari. These are the names of the sons of Gershom, Libni and Shimei. The sons of Kohath were Amram, Izhar, Hebron, and Uzziel. The sons of Merari were Machli and Mushi, and these are the families of the Levites according to their fathers' households. Of Gershom, Libni his son, Jahath his son, Zimmah his son, Joah his son, Edo his son, Zerah his son, Jeatherai his son. The sons of Kohath were Aminadab his son, Korah his son, Asir his son, Elkanah his son, Abiasaph his son, and Asir his son, Tahath his son, Uriel his son, Uzziah his son, Shaul his son. The sons of Elkanah were Amasai and Ahimoth. As for Elkanah, the sons of Elkanah were Zophai his son, and Nahath his son, Eliab his son, Jeroham his son, Elkanah his son, and that's the Elkanah that we're concerned with here. There's a lot of people named Elkanah in this list, but verse 27 is the one that we're talking about. In verse 28, the sons of Samuel were Joel the firstborn and Abijah the second. And again, you get to verse 36, Elkanah is listed again. Elkanah the son of... I got that wrong. Verse 33, those who served with their sons from the sons of the Kohathites were Heman the singer, the son of Joel, the son of Samuel, the son of Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Eliel, the son of Toah, the son of Zuph. And basically what you see is he's listed among the Levites. And that, all complicated thing, all that to explain, this does justify why Samuel is able to serve in the capacity of a priest, because he's from the tribe of Levi. He's able to do that. In fact, in Psalm 99 in verse 6, Samuel is listed with Moses and Aaron among those who invoked the name of the Lord as priests. Psalm 99 in verse 6 it says that Moses and Aaron were among his priests, and Samuel was among those who called on his name. They called upon the Lord, and he answered them. So even though it says that one of the men that Elkanah was a descendant of was an Ephraimite, it seems to me that he's called that more because he lived in Ephraim and not necessarily because he was descended from Ephraim. Chronicles seems to indicate that Elkanah was descended from Levi. Now Elkanah has two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Hannah means favor with Yahweh. Peninnah, the meaning is a little more disputed, can mean the fruitful woman. But Peninnah has children. She is certainly fruitful, while Hannah is not. She does not have children. What does that remind us of? Sarah, Rachel. Lots of women in the Bible that are barren. And what happens in every single one of those stories? The Lord opens the womb. Every time in the Bible you read about a woman not being able to have children, you can pretty much bet that by the end of the story, she's going to have a kid. That's almost universal, the whole thing. Yes, Jen? It's almost always a son. I'm trying to think of exceptions. Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Samson's mother, Elizabeth. But the lesson in all of this is that God is the one that opens and shuts the womb. In 1 Samuel 2 and verse 5, in the song that Hannah sings, one of the points she makes is that even the barren gives birth to 7, but she who has many children languishes. God is the God who determines who can have offspring and who cannot have offspring. In every one of these stories, God is always the one that opens the womb. Well, of course, we learn Elkanah, he goes to Shiloh on a regular basis. Shiloh was where the tabernacle was located. It was the place where they had set up the sanctuary of the Lord for the people to come worship. In Deuteronomy 12, that was the only place that the Israelites were allowed to come and worship. They could not offer sacrifices anywhere they felt like. They had to go to the temple or the tabernacle of the Lord at Shiloh. Even though everybody else in Israel is doing what is right in their own eyes, Elkanah is going annually to the house of the Lord. Although the law did specify 3 annual feasts, Elkanah is going there once a year, but he's still going. I guess that's something. This is another random interesting fact, is that this is the first time in the entire Bible we see the phrase Lord of Hosts used in verse 3. This man would go up from his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of Hosts in Shiloh. It's a pretty common name for God, but it doesn't appear anywhere before 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 3. And there's a passing mention of Hophni and Phinehas in verse 3 as well. They're going to be more important when we get to chapter 2 and following. Elkanah, he gives sacrificial portions to his sons and to his wife Peninnah, but he gives a double portion to Hannah because he loves her more. There's always the problem, and every time you see a situation in the Bible where a man is married to more than one woman, there's almost always some tension between them or conflict. It's especially the case with Jacob and his 2 wives, Leah and Rachel. The law of Moses forbid taking a woman and her sister as a wife as a rival while she is alive in Leviticus chapter, I think it's chapter 18. But in this instance, Hannah and Peninnah have a little bit of a bitter rivalry going on. They don't get along very well, and she provokes Hannah. Peninnah is her tormentor. In some ways, this resembles Leah and Rachel. The unloved wife is the one who has children, and the loved wife is the one who's barren. It's a little different from Leah and Rachel in that Leah is a little bit more of a commendable character in that story than Peninnah is. But of course, Hannah's reaction to not having children is a little different from Rachel's. And Hannah's reaction to having children is a little different from Rachel's. When Rachel first has a son, the first thing she says is, "May the Lord add to me another." And she names him Joseph, which means, he adds. Her first response, she's waited and waited and waited, and she finally has a child, and she says, "I want another one." The second child kills her in childbirth. You see that Rachel is just the kind of the epitome of bitterness in the Genesis story. She's portrayed as the thief and the idolater throughout, but Hannah's reaction to having children is a little different than that. When she has a son, she dedicates him to the Lord. The rivalry between Hannah and Peninnah upsets her in verse 7 to the point where she refuses to eat. And Elkanah tries to console her and says, "Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" Well, what is that? What does that mean? He's clueless. Yeah, it doesn't really solve her problem, does it? No. He loves, "I love you more, honey. My love is better to you than 7 children. I still want a child." There is that little thing going on. On the one hand, he does love her more. He gives her more of the peace offering portion. But on the other hand, he's not able to give her what she needs. For that, she must turn to the Lord, to Yahweh. That brings us down to the end of verse 8. Any comments or questions before we move into the next part? All right. Somebody want to read verses 9 through 18?
Hannah arose after they finished eating silent. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle of the Lord. He was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. Then she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor. And it happened as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli watched her mouth. Now Hannah spoke in her heart. Her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, How long will you be drunk? Put your wine away from you. Hannah answered and said, No, my Lord. I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant a wicked woman, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief I have spoken. Then Eli answered and said, Go in peace. God of Israel grant your petition. Ask of him. He said, Let your maidservant find favor in your sight. So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad.
All right. So we have Hannah's prayer here, and in verse 9 we learn that after eating and drinking in Shiloh, this would have been after the meal that would have taken place there, she goes to the temple of the Lord. I noticed the version you're reading says tabernacle actually in verse 9. That's kind of interesting. I guess the New King James took a liberty there. Let me ask you something. Does anybody else's version have tabernacle there in verse 9? Tabernacle of the Lord? Okay. Yeah, mine said... Yeah, mine says temple as well. The word there is hekal, which is the usual word for temple or palace. But it's a... Now, of course, this raises a question, and one that I've indicated on the sheet, and one that the New King James and maybe some of the other versions have tried to solve for you by putting tabernacle there instead of temple. But why is the temple of the Lord? Why is it called a temple in verse 9? That's where the ark of the Lord is, okay, yeah. Now, had the actual temple been built yet?
Depends on what you're talking about when you say temple.
Ah, yeah.
Because Solomon's temple was considered a permanent place, but it didn't last very long. It was destroyed, then it was rebuilt. And what was it, by Jesus' day, was that like the fourth temple?
No, it's referred to as the second temple. I mean, it's a... By Jesus...
Didn't Pilate rebuild it, or Herod rebuild it?
What happened was they rebuilt the temple in the time of Zerubbabel, and Herod was involved in a renovation of that same temple.
Oh, okay.
But it's the same temple, it's just, it was under remodeling, I guess we might say. But I mean, for all practical purposes, the Jews referred to that as their second temple. And it's... I mean, there's a couple of things that have happened. Either yes, they're calling this the temple, even though it's really the tent, or, and there's another theory out there that they had actually built a more permanent structure at Shiloh without any divine instruction. But against that, I would say in verse 22 of chapter 2, it makes reference to the fact that Eli's sons were laying with the woman who served at the doorway of the tent of meeting. In Psalm 78 and verse 60, it describes how the tent was destroyed at Shiloh. Psalm 78 verse 60 says that, So he abandoned the dwelling place at Shiloh, the tent which he had pitched among men, and gave up his strength to captivity and his glory into the hand of the adversary. The fact that in 2 Samuel 7, the Lord says, I have never lived in a house prior to the point where I brought you up from the land of Egypt. 2 Samuel 7 and verse 6. So all that to say, this is probably just, again, the tent of meeting being referred to as a temple.
Probably considered that permanent dwelling place of the tabernacle.
Yeah. I mean, the tabernacle was set up in Shiloh in the days of Joshua, and it didn't move from then on. There's actually some Sumerian evidence. The Sumerian word for temple, egal, is similarly used of tents in some texts. So I mean, that might be parallel to it here. I thought I'd bring that up because, every now and then somebody reads that and goes, what's the temple doing there in verse 9? Well, that's what it is. Hannah is praying. She's greatly distressed after eating and drinking, and perhaps after the setting of eating and drinking invites Eli's suspicions, but she makes a vow in her prayer. If God will give me a son, if God will remember me and give me a son, she will dedicate that son to the Lord. What specifically does she vow for her son here? A Nazirite vow. Now, she doesn't use the word Nazirite, but what does she say? Verse 11. No razor will come on his head, in verse 11. The Septuagint adds the phrase, and he will have no strong wine or strong drink. The Nazirite vow is described in Numbers chapter 6. There were actually 3 things that a Nazirite was supposed to do in Israel. One of them, they were not supposed to shave their head. The second is that they were not supposed to have any wine or pretty much anything that came off of the grapes at all. No grapes, not even the skins of the seeds. And the third thing was that they could not come in contact with a corpse. They defiled them. If they broke any of these rules, they had to shave their hair and start over from scratch. Now, Samuel's Nazirite vow is a little different. It doesn't have a time limit on it. It is perpetual throughout his entire life. That's why she says, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. Now, when Hannah's asking for a son, and she's immediately saying, I'm going to give him back to the Lord, what does that suggest about her motive here? You might get the other wife off her back. Okay. Yeah. Okay, all right. That's one way to look at it. It was definitely... it's so backwards. The way our culture perceives children as a burden, the biblical culture consistently perceives children as a blessing. And it's pretty straightforward. But Hannah doesn't want... Hannah's saying, if you give me this child, I will dedicate him to you all the days of his life. Well, what does that really suggest about her motive here? I'm going to have a son, and then I'm immediately going to dedicate him to your service. Basically, he's sent off to tabernacle boarding school for the rest of his life, or something like that. Yes. Right. And that seems to me more the idea we're getting at here. It's not about her personal benefit. It is about ultimately bringing glory to God. Is there any other Old Testament story that this might be comparable to? God gives me a son, I'm going to give him back. Abraham. Yeah. When the Lord promises a son to Abraham, He tells him through Isaac your descendants will be named. And then in Genesis 22, He does the unthinkable. He tells Abraham, I want you to take that son, that your only son whom you love, and I want you to offer him up as a burnt offering. That's kind of shocking. Some people have a problem with the fact that God even told Abraham to do that. And Abraham does it anyway. He obeys in faith. And it shows the level and the depth of his commitment. The Hebrew author says that Abraham considered that God was even able to raise the dead. And the point, of course, is a test of Abraham. But it's parallel to Hannah's situation here. That ultimately, her son does not belong to her. Her son belongs to the Lord. And she simply wishes for the Lord to demonstrate His glory through her. So it says that her motive for having a son seems to be more selfless than anything. Maybe there's a part of her that wants to stick it to Penina, but that doesn't seem to be the primary point of the story. Yes, Mark.
Isn't that type? God sent His Son to the world to give Him to us.
Oh, yes. Yes, there's a lot of parallels between Samuel and Jesus. It's kind of interesting how that works. But, God could have kept His Son up in heaven, not shared Him with us. That's not what happened. He instead sends Him to us, a corrupt world, a world far more corrupt than than He ever really is a part of. Just as Hannah is kind of sending Samuel into really a very bad situation, isn't she? In chapter 2, we're going to learn that Eli's sons weren't great guys. They did not know the Lord. They did not love the Lord. They robbed the sacrifices. They slept with the women who served at the door of the tent of meeting. They were bad people. And Hannah gives her son to this man who's Eli, who's clearly not proven himself as a parent in any way. But Samuel winds up becoming, well, the savior of Israel in some ways. Almost a new Moses, if you will. And ultimately foreshadows Jesus. Well, of course, Hannah's saying all these things, and Eli spots her. He's sitting at the door of the tent meeting, and he decides she's drunk. Why does he conclude that? Her lips were moving, and she couldn't. Yeah, okay, so she's babbling without making sounds. Why else might have Eli concluded this? You're crazy. Yeah. I mean, and maybe this is just maybe this is off track, but I'm almost of the opinion that Eli's projecting a little bit here too. I mean, his son. It's kind of interesting. Hannah's response to him is, do not, in verse 16, do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, literally a daughter of Belial. That was an idiom that the Hebrews used for a worthless person, or a son of Belial. But then you get to 1 Samuel 2, verse 12, the sons of Eli were worthless men. They were sons of Belial. They did not know the Lord. And so here Eli's mistaking Hannah for a worthless woman, but he's got two worthless sons living in his house, doesn't he? There's the irony of it, right? We're supposed to see that connection. But that's what the problem is. Eli is in some ways kind of, he's mistaking Hannah for what he's got in his house. And, of course, what we see is Eli rebukes Hannah, and Hannah responds. She is not drunk. She is merely oppressed in spirit. Instead of pouring out wine for herself, she has poured out her soul to Yahweh. Do not consider me a worthless woman, she says. She's distressed because she wants a son. And when she says that, Eli blesses her and wishes her well. He blesses her and basically wishes on her that God will fulfill her request and her petition. And in verse 18, she says, let your maidservant find favor in your sight. She goes away and she eats, and she's no longer sad. I think that's kind of interesting how, in verses 7 and 8, she was so upset by what Peninnah was saying and doing that she refused to eat. But now here her spirits are lifted. Her sadness is not taken away by the presence of a child. No child has been born yet. Her sadness is not taken away by that. Her sadness is taken away by the fact that she prayed to the Lord about it. That's key to this whole thing. Yes, Jen? Yeah, that's a good question. Hannah arose after eating and drinking. There's two ways you can read that. One is that, after she ate and drank, she went and did this. Another way to read that is after the eating and the drinking. Yes, after dinner. That's another suggestion that's put out there. Which, maybe she skipped, I don't know if she skipped dinner or whatnot. For whatever reason, and maybe the fact that there's just been an eating and drinking is why Eli concludes, she must have had a little bit too much to drink at dinner. And she says, no, that's not the case. You've got it completely wrong. There are two ways to read that, and either one works grammatically. So I'll just throw that out there. Okay, so, but her sadness is lifted by the act of prayer, and then we get God's answer to her prayer. Can I get a volunteer to read verses 19 through 28?
The woman after along with flour and brought him whole life.
All right, so Samuel is born here. God remembers Hannah in verse 19. Every time in the Bible God remembers somebody, it's usually considered a good thing. God remembers Noah, He remembers Abraham, He remembers Rachel. It is an answer to her request in verse 11 that if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me. And she has a son, and she names him Samuel. What does the name Samuel mean? Asked of God, heard of God. Anybody else got another answer to that? I'm just curious. Your Bible got footnotes on this? What?
God.
Heard by God. God hears. What? Heard of God, heard by God, asked of God. And another common possibility is the name of God. Shem and El put together. There's kind of an endless debate about which one of those is actually the case. What she says is, because I have asked him of the Lord, which there's a word play between the verb for asking, Sha'al, and the verb for Shemuel. Now, there is another theory out there. It's kind of off base, I think, but this is really Saul's birth story, and that Samuel was an invented character after the fact. I don't really buy that, because there's no evidence for it. But you get this picture here. Whatever this is, all of those meanings are clearly applicable to this. God hears. God heard her prayer. She asked him of the Lord, and the Lord gave her what she asked for. But what was interesting is how this wordplay carries on in the verses 27 and 28. This boy I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition which I asked of him. So I have also, and my version says dedicated, but literally, I also ask him for Yahweh. As long as he lives, he has asked for Yahweh, and he worshiped the Lord there. The word ask is being used kind of with a double meaning, and it's lost a little bit in English, but it has the connotation of dedication here. So because she asked him from the Lord, she now asks him to work for the Lord, we might say. It's an interesting wordplay that she makes on this, anyhow. Now, Hannah refuses to go up to the tabernacle until Samuel is weaned. Anybody know when a child would have been weaned in those times? It would have been about 3 years. Yeah, they nursed their children a lot longer in the ancient world than we do in our present society. But Samuel would have been about 2 or 3 years old when this happened. And the husbands, in Numbers chapter 30, Numbers 30 specifies that husbands had the right to confirm or annul their wives' vows. And in this case, Elkanah confirms her vow and says, do what seems best to you. Literally, do what is right in your eyes until you've weaned him, and may the Lord confirm his word. And when that happens, when he's weaned, she finally takes him up to Shiloh, takes 3-year-old Samuel up to Shiloh with a 3-year-old bull. There's an argument out there that it's actually 3 bulls instead of 1 3-year-old bull. I don't know what to think about that. But these would have been a kind of a votive offering. In Israel, there were 5 kinds of sacrifices. One of them was the peace offering. There were 3 kinds of peace offerings. So I guess there's really like 7 sacrifices or whatnot. But there are 3 kinds of peace offerings. There was the free will offering, which was kind of your gift to God just because. There was the thanksgiving offering, which as the name implies, was for thanksgiving. And there was the votive offering. You didn't have to make vows, but if you made a vow, you had to offer a sacrifice to fulfill that vow. That's what the votive offering was for, and that's what Hannah is offering here. They slaughter the bull, they bring the boy to Eli, and she brings him to Eli, and she identifies herself and says, I'm the woman you were talking to who was making that request, and you thought those bad things about me, but now the Lord's given me my petition, and here he is, and I'm going to fulfill my end of the deal and dedicate him to the Lord. And so now she keeps her vow. Samuel will be dedicated to Yahweh until the day of his death. I realize I just answered question 10. How long was Samuel dedicated to the Lord? All his life. Is that the normal time that a Levite was dedicated to the Lord? How long did Levites usually work for? Anybody know? This is back in the obscure passages in the law. In Numbers chapter 8, in verses... I neglected to enter it into these notes. Numbers chapter 8, verses 24 and 25. I'll start in verse 23. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "This is what applies to the Levites. From 25 years old and upward, they shall enter to perform service in the work of the tent of meeting. But at the age of 50 years, they shall retire from service in the work and not do any more. They may, however, assist their brothers in the tent of meeting to keep an obligation, but they themselves shall not do work. Thus you shall deal with the Levites concerning their obligations." The Levites' general tenure was 25 years. Samuel is dedicated to work for as long as he lives. He is now he doesn't serve in the capacity of high priest, but he does seem to kind of fill that role when there's a gap in Eli's leadership with him and his sons are dead. Yes, Gail. Couldn't be more than 25 years. Yeah.
Anywhere in there.
Right, 25 to 50. That's the general point of it. Deuteronomy actually talks about how, obviously if you don't live at Shiloh, you can't help. But Deuteronomy 18 talks about how if a Levite ever visits Shiloh, he's obligated to help out while he's there. As long as he's visiting. He's obligated to help out, and he's entitled to eat of the sacrificial portions as well. That's in Deuteronomy 18, I think in the first 8 verses. Okay. So anyhow, Samuel's dedicated for life and serves in this Levitical capacity all his life. And the chapter division's not great here, but we're going to have to cut it short for next time. But what happens next is Hannah prays this song of thanksgiving, where prayer and a song, prayer and singing overlap with each other. So in chapter 2 we have the Song of Hannah, which she expresses her, basically her reflections on what happens here and how the Lord has reversed her circumstances and how God in general is a God who reverses circumstances for His people. We'll look at that next time, Lord willing. Anybody got any last minute thoughts, observations, just lingering questions they just want to know the answer to? All right, well, we will pick up in chapter 2 next time.